Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Picture yourself standing in the windswept sands of Middle Egypt, near the ancient site of Hawara. Beneath your feet lie the scattered stones of what may have been the most extraordinary structure ever built in the ancient world. Nearly 2,500 years ago, the Greek historian Herodotus gazed upon a colossal complex here and declared that it surpassed even the pyramids in wonder. He described a labyrinth of 3,000 rooms, half buried beneath the earth, half rising above it, with 12 great courts and passages so intricate that no visitor could find their way without a guide. Today, this lost labyrinth has all but vanished. Only broken stones and mysterious radar anomalies hint at what once stood here. Yet ancient sources insisted this marvel exceeded anything else in Egypt. So what was this impossible structure? How could something so magnificent simply disappear? And did the labyrinth that surpassed the pyramids ever truly exist at all? But before we begin our journey into the sands of time, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. You find yourself drawn deeper into this desolate landscape, where the evening wind carries whispers of a civilization that once commanded the known world. Here, at Hawara, the sand shifts and settles over foundations that may have supported the most ambitious architectural achievement of ancient Egypt. The air grows cooler as twilight approaches, and in this hushed moment between day and night, you can almost sense the weight of 3 millennia pressing down through the layers of accumulated earth and stone. Beneath your feet, ground-penetrating radar has revealed tantalizing anomalies, geometric patterns that suggest vast chambers and corridors extending far below the modern surface. The technology speaks in the language of electromagnetic waves and digital imaging, but what it whispers is far more ancient. Something enormous lies buried here, something that once drew travellers from across the Mediterranean world to stand in wonder at what they could scarcely believe. You're standing at the edge of one of history's most perplexing mysteries. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, claimed to have walked through this very site when it was still intact, still functioning, still capable of reducing visitors to speechless amazement. He described a complex of 3,000 rooms arranged in 12 great courts, half of them carved into the living rock beneath the earth, the other half rising above ground in a forest of columns and corridors that seemed to extend beyond the horizon. The Labyrinth, as the Greeks called it, was said to surpass even the Great Pyramid of Giza in its magnificence. Herodotus, who had seen the wonders of Babylon and the temples of Memphis, declared that words failed him when he attempted to capture the scale and intricacy of what lay before him here in the Fayum oasis. He wrote of passages that twisted and turned through seemingly endless chambers, of walls covered in intricate reliefs depicting the gods and pharaohs of Egypt, of a complexity so overwhelming that no visitor could navigate its depths without a guide. But Herodotus was not alone in his awe. Strabo, the Roman geographer, also wrote of this place, as did Pliny the Elder and other ancient authorities. They spoke of it as one of the marvels of the world, a structure that embodied the power and sophistication of Egyptian civilization at its height. Yet today, as you survey this windswept plateau, you see only scattered blocks of limestone, fragments of granite columns, and the weathered remnants of what was once the pyramid of Amenemhat III, the pharaoh who may have commissioned this extraordinary complex in the 19th century before the Common Era. The silence here is profound, broken only by the soft whisper of sand against stone. You walk slowly across the uneven ground, feeling the crunch of ancient mortar beneath your feet, pausing occasionally to examine a carved fragment that hints at the artistic sophistication of the original structure. The setting sun casts long shadows across the ruins, and in this golden light, you can begin to imagine the labyrinth as it once was, when the Nile's annual flood still reached this far into the desert, when Lake Moeris stretched to the horizon, and when the administrative heart of the Middle Kingdom pulsed with the rhythms of bureaucracy and ritual. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty were master engineers, transforming the natural depression of the Fayum into one of Egypt's most productive agricultural regions through an elaborate system of canals and drainage works. They understood the power of water, the necessity of controlling and directing the Nile's life-giving flood, and they built accordingly. The labyrinth was more than a monument to royal power. It was the administrative centre of this hydraulic empire, a place where the complex business of governing a kingdom dependent on the river's annual cycle was conducted with methodical precision. Yet for all the ancient testimonies, for all the archaeological evidence that something significant once stood here, profound questions remain. Did Herodotus exaggerate what he saw? Did the labyrinth truly contain 3,000 rooms? Or was this number symbolic, rhetorical, a way of expressing immensity that ancient audiences would have understood differently than we do? How much of what we think we know about this place comes from careful observation, and how much from the human tendency to embellish, to transform the merely impressive into the miraculous? As darkness settles over the site, you realize that the labyrinth presents us with a puzzle that extends far beyond archaeology. Here was a structure that ancient observers insisted surpassed the pyramids themselves, yet it has vanished so completely that modern scholars debate whether it ever existed as described. The mystery lies not just in what happened to these 3,000 rooms, but in the gap between ancient testimony and present reality, between the wonder of the past and the silence of the stones that remain. To understand the labyrinth, we must first journey backward through time, beyond the Roman conquests, beyond the Greek travellers who marvelled at its ruins, beyond even the memory of those who built it. We must travel nearly 4,000 years into the past, to the reign of Amenemhat III, a pharaoh whose name meant Amun is in front, and whose ambitions would reshape not only the landscape of Egypt, but the very concept of what a royal monument could become. You find yourself standing in the Fayum oasis during the 19th century before the Common Era, but this is not the desert margin you might expect. Instead, you're surrounded by a vast network of canals, dikes, and carefully managed waterways that transform what was once a seasonal flood basin into Egypt's most productive agricultural region. The air is heavy with the scent of rich alluvial soil, and the sound of flowing water creates a constant gentle murmur across the landscape. This is the Middle Kingdom at its height, and here in the Fayum you witness one of history's most ambitious exercises in hydraulic engineering. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty understood that power in Egypt flowed as surely as the Nile itself. They recognized that controlling water meant controlling life, and that he who could direct the river's annual flood could command the loyalty and resources of an entire kingdom. The Fayum Depression, a natural basin that lay below sea level southwest of Memphis, presented both an opportunity and a challenge. During the annual inundation, when the Nile swelled with the summer rains of distant Ethiopia, excess water could be channeled into this depression, creating a vast reservoir that the Greeks would later call Lake Moeris. But this was far more than simple flood control. The engineers of Amenemhat III designed an intricate system of canals and sluices that allowed them to regulate the flow of water into and out of the Fayum basin with remarkable precision. During high flood years, excess water was stored in the lake, preventing devastating floods downstream. During low flood years, this stored water could be released back into the Nile system, ensuring adequate irrigation for the crucial agricultural season. You can almost hear the calculations being made in the royal workshops, scribes working with reed pens and papyrus to calculate volumes, flow rates, and the complex timing required to make such a system function across the agricultural calendar. The success of this hydraulic project created unprecedented prosperity for the kingdom, but it also presented Amenemhat III with a unique problem. Where should he build his eternal resting place, his pyramid and mortuary complex? The traditional sites near Memphis were already crowded with the monuments of earlier dynasties, and the pharaoh's engineers were discovering that the soft, waterlogged ground near the new lake presented significant challenges for traditional pyramid construction. Yet it was precisely here, at the heart of his greatest engineering triumph, that Amenemhat chose to build his final monument. You walk slowly across the construction site at Hawara, watching as thousands of workers move with the methodical precision that characterizes all great Egyptian building projects. Limestone blocks are being ferried across the canal system on specially designed barges, while teams of oxen drag granite elements from distant quarries in the south. The pyramid itself, though substantial, seems almost modest compared to the vast complex of buildings spreading out around its base. This is where the traditional concept of a mortuary temple begins to transform into something unprecedented in Egyptian architecture. The mortuary complex of a pharaoh had always served multiple functions. It was a temple where priests would perform the daily rituals necessary to maintain the king's spiritual well-being in the afterlife. It was a storehouse where the vast wealth needed to fund these eternal ceremonies would be kept and managed. It was an administrative centre from which the King's Mortuary Foundation would oversee its agricultural estates and business interests. But Amenemhat III's vision extended far beyond these traditional functions. As you observe the construction, you begin to understand that what is taking shape here is not merely a mortuary temple, but the administrative heart of the Fayum project itself. The complex will serve as the headquarters from which the entire hydraulic system will be managed, where the technical expertise needed to maintain the canals and regulate the flow of water will be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The priests who tend the king's eternal flame will also be the engineers who ensure that his greatest earthly achievement continues to function long after his death. The scale of the undertaking becomes apparent as you walk through the emerging structure. Courtyards large enough to accommodate the bureaucratic apparatus of an entire province are taking shape, surrounded by chambers and halls designed to house not only the ritual objects necessary for the king's afterlife, but also the maps, survey records, and technical manuals required to maintain the Fayum's complex water management systems. This is architecture as both monument and machine, a building designed to serve the practical needs of hydraulic engineering, while simultaneously asserting the divine authority of the pharaoh who made it all possible. The workers speak of building something that will surpass all previous royal monuments, not simply in scale, but in complexity and purpose. They are creating a structure that will combine temple, palace, archive, and engineering headquarters into a single, integrated whole. As the sun sets over the construction site, you realize you are witnessing the birth of something entirely new in human architecture, a building that will challenge every assumption about what a monument can be and do. To comprehend the achievement that would become known as the Egyptian Labyrinth, we must first understand the extraordinary logistics required to transform Amenemhat III's vision into stone and mortar reality. You find yourself at the edge of the Tura limestone quarries, across the Nile from Memphis, where teams of skilled workers have been carving building blocks from the living rock for generations. The quarry face rises in stepped terraces, each level carefully planned to yield stones of specific dimensions. The sound of copper chisels against stone creates a rhythmic percussion that echoes through the chambers, while the sweeter notes of wooden mallets on wooden wedges provide a counterpoint as workers split blocks along natural fault lines. The scale of material required for the Hawara complex defies easy comprehension. Beyond the pyramid itself, which would consume tens of thousands of limestone blocks, the labyrinth demanded stone for foundations, walls, columns, lintels, and the countless architectural elements that would create its legendary complexity. Granite from the quarries of Aswan, over 600 miles to the south, would be needed for columns and door frames, while local sandstone and mud bricks would provide bulk and structure for the less visible elements. You watch as massive blocks are loaded onto barges specially reinforced to handle their weight, beginning a journey down the Nile that will take weeks to complete. The transport of these materials represents one of the most sophisticated logistics operations of the ancient world. The Nile's annual flood provides the high water necessary to move the heavier stones, but the timing must be precisely calculated. Too early, and the quarries may still be flooded. Too late, and falling water levels could strand loaded barges in the shallows. The canal system that connects the Nile to Lake Moeris and the Hawara site requires constant maintenance to ensure that barges carrying multi-ton granite elements can navigate safely to their destination. But the labyrinth was never intended to be merely a monument of stone. As you walk through the construction site during its peak phase, you begin to understand that Amenemhat III and his architects were creating something fundamentally different from any previous Egyptian structure. The traditional mortuary temple followed well-established patterns, with a causeway leading from a valley temple to a mortuary temple adjacent to the pyramid. The labyrinth, however, was designed to serve dual functions that had never been combined on such a scale. The northern section of the complex was conceived as a palace, a working administrative centre where the business of governing the Fayum region would be conducted by living officials. Here you would find archives containing the detailed records necessary to manage the hydraulic systems, chambers where engineers would meet to plan maintenance of the canal network, and halls where disputes over water rights and agricultural boundaries would be resolved. This was the practical heart of the complex, designed for the efficient movement of people, documents, and information. The southern section, by contrast, was purely sacred space, a mortuary temple in the traditional sense where priests would perform the daily rituals necessary to maintain the pharaoh's spiritual well-being in the afterlife. Yet even here, the scale exceeded anything previously attempted. Where earlier mortuary temples might have comprised a dozen chambers, Herodotus would later describe finding 1,500 rooms above ground level, arranged in 12 great courts, 6 facing north toward the realm of the living, 6 facing south toward the realm of the dead. You walk slowly through the emerging structure as construction nears completion, marvelling at the architectural innovations required to create such complexity while maintaining structural integrity. The builders have developed new techniques for supporting vast roof spans, using a forest of columns to distribute weight while preserving the open spaces necessary for the labyrinth's multiple functions. The play of light and shadow through these columned halls creates an ever-changing pattern as the sun moves across the sky, while the careful placement of doorways and windows ensures that important chambers receive optimal illumination at specific times of day. The sensory experience of moving through the completed labyrinth would have been overwhelming. You enter through one of the 12 courts, perhaps the first of the northern courts, where the morning sun streams through carefully positioned openings to illuminate walls covered in carved reliefs, depicting the pharaoh's divine authority. The limestone surfaces are still pale and fresh, unmarked by centuries of weathering, and the hieroglyphic inscriptions stand out in sharp relief, their pigments bright with the red ochre, blue copper carbonate, and yellow orpiment that bring the carved scenes to life. As you move deeper into the complex, the acoustic properties of the architecture become apparent. The high ceilings and hard stone surfaces create a subtle echo that transforms the ordinary sounds of human activity into something more mysterious and profound. Footsteps on stone floors acquire a rhythmic quality. Voices carry and blend in unexpected ways, and the distant sound of water from the nearby canals provides a constant, gentle backdrop to the human activity within the walls. The underground chambers present an entirely different sensory experience. Here, reached by carefully constructed stairways that descend into the living rock, you find the 1,500 rooms that Herodotus claimed were kept hidden from foreign visitors. The temperature drops noticeably as you descend, and the air carries the distinctive coolness and slight humidity of subterranean spaces. Oil lamps provide the only illumination, creating pools of warm light that reveal chamber after chamber extending into darkness beyond the reach of their flickering flames. These underground spaces serve the most sacred functions of the mortuary complex, housing the treasures and ritual objects necessary for the pharaoh's eternal journey, as well as the administrative records that must be preserved for perpetuity. The walls here are covered with some of the finest relief carving ever produced by Egyptian craftsmen, scenes of the afterlife rendered with exquisite attention to detail, every hieroglyph precisely cut and painted to ensure its magical efficacy in the world beyond death. You find yourself walking through the labyrinth during the golden decades of the 18th dynasty before the Common Era, when Amenemhat III's great complex has reached its full maturity as the beating heart of the Fayum administration. The morning sun slants through the carefully positioned openings in the eastern walls of the first court, illuminating scenes carved in low relief that depict the eternal cycle of the Nile's flood, the sprouting of grain, and the presentation of tribute to the divine pharaoh. The air carries the mingled scents of frankincense from the temple ceremonies, cedar oil used to preserve papyrus documents, and the distant fragrance of lotus blossoms from the canals that connect this administrative centre to the broader irrigation network. As you move through the complex, you become aware of the gentle hum of human activity that fills these vast spaces from dawn until dusk. In the northern courts, where the administrative functions of the complex are centred, you hear the soft scratch of reed pens on papyrus as dozens of scribes record the endless details required to maintain the Fayum's hydraulic systems. They sit cross-legged on reed mats, their writing palettes balanced on their knees, carefully noting water levels in the various canals, calculating the optimal timing for opening and closing sluices, and maintaining the detailed maps that show every field, every waterway, every settlement in their administrative domain. The scribes represent just one layer of the complex hierarchy that makes the labyrinth function. You pass groups of surveyors discussing the maintenance requirements for a canal section that has begun to silt up after the previous year's particularly heavy flood. Their conversation is technical, precise, focused on the practical challenges of keeping water flowing where it is needed, while preventing erosion and overflow. Nearby, temple officials consult with palace administrators about the allocation of grain from the royal estates, their deliberations reflecting the complex relationship between sacred and secular authority that characterizes all aspects of life in the labyrinth. The acoustic properties of the architecture enhance rather than obscure these human sounds. The high ceilings and carefully proportioned chambers create a resonance that transforms the ordinary business of government into something approaching music. Footsteps on polished stone floors acquire a rhythmic quality as officials move between meetings, while the distant sound of water flowing through the canal system provides a constant, gentle backdrop that reminds everyone of the hydraulic foundation upon which their entire civilization depends. You follow a corridor lined with painted columns toward one of the inner courts, where craftsmen are at work maintaining and enhancing the complex's decorative program. Stone carvers sit before partially completed reliefs, their copper chisels moving with practiced precision as they transform rough limestone surfaces into scenes of startling beauty and complexity. A master sculptor guides his apprentices through the intricacies of carving hieroglyphs, explaining how each symbol must be perfectly proportioned and precisely positioned to maintain both its aesthetic impact and its magical efficacy. The economic life of the labyrinth reflects the broader prosperity of the Fayum region during this golden age. You observe merchants from across Egypt presenting their goods in the great receiving halls, their offerings reflecting the diverse resources that the kingdom's trade networks can command. Cedar wood from Lebanon, electrum from Nubia, exotic stones from the desert quarries, papyrus from the delta marshes, all flow through the labyrinth storerooms as tribute to the pharaoh's divine authority and as raw materials for the complex's ongoing construction and decoration projects. The integration of sacred and secular functions within the labyrinth creates a unique rhythm of daily life. Temple priests begin their day before dawn with the opening ceremonies that symbolically awaken the divine presence within the complex, their chanted prayers echoing through chambers that will later fill with the more mundane sounds of administrative business. As the sun rises higher, the temple activities gradually give way to the practical work of governance, but the boundary between sacred and secular remains fluid, with religious ceremonies punctuating the administrative schedule at regular intervals throughout the day. In the southern sections of the complex, where the mortuary functions predominate, you encounter a different but equally complex pattern of activity. Here, priests tend the elaborate rituals necessary to maintain Amenemhat III's spiritual well-being in the afterlife, their ceremonies requiring careful coordination with the temple workshops that produce the offerings, incense, and ritual objects necessary for these eternal observances. The underground chambers, those 1,500 rooms that Herodotus would later describe but never be permitted to enter, house not only the treasures of the royal burial but also the archives containing the most sensitive records of the kingdom's administrative and religious activities. The labyrinth's role as a centre of learning becomes apparent as you observe the young scribes and junior officials who come here for training in the complex skills required to manage a hydraulic civilization. They study under master administrators who have spent decades perfecting their understanding of water management, agricultural planning, and the intricate ceremonial protocols that maintain the proper relationship between earthly and divine authority. This is education as apprenticeship, knowledge transmitted through patient observation and gradual assumption of responsibility rather than through abstract instruction. As evening approaches and the western light begins to fade, the labyrinth's daily rhythm gradually winds down. The administrative courts empty as officials return to their homes in the nearby settlements, while the temple areas take on renewed activity as the evening ceremonies begin. You realize that you have witnessed not merely a building in use, but an entire civilization in miniature, a place where the practical and the sacred, the temporal and the eternal, the human and the divine, converge in a complex harmony that represents the Middle Kingdom at its most sophisticated and assured. In the carved reliefs that cover nearly every surface of the labyrinth, you discover a visual language of unprecedented sophistication, one that transforms stone into a medium for expressing concepts that stretch far beyond the merely decorative. As you move slowly through the great halls, your torch casting flickering shadows across the limestone walls, you begin to understand that these images constitute nothing less than a complete theology of royal power, death, and eternal continuity rendered in imperishable stone. The craftsmen who created these works were not merely decorating a building, They were constructing a permanent bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. The mortuary symbolism embedded within the Labyrinth's artistic program reflects the full maturity of Middle Kingdom religious thought. Here, in these countless chambers, the traditional Egyptian understanding of death as transformation rather than ending finds its most complete architectural expression. You pause before a wall where scenes of the pharaoh's journey through the underworld unfold in meticulous detail, each figure precisely carved and painted according to conventions that have been refined over centuries of royal tomb decoration. Yet the scale here exceeds anything previously attempted, creating an immersive environment where the boundary between symbolic representation and spiritual reality becomes blurred. The artistic achievement represented by the Labyrinth's decorative program cannot be measured merely in terms of technical skill, though the craftsmanship is extraordinary. More significant is the way these images work together to create a coherent vision of royal divinity that encompasses both the pharaoh's earthly responsibilities and his eternal destiny. As you walk through the corridors, you observe how scenes of hydraulic engineering and agricultural abundance are seamlessly integrated with traditional religious imagery, creating a visual narrative that celebrates Amenemhat III's practical achievements, while simultaneously affirming his divine nature. The Labyrinth's fame began to spread beyond Egypt's borders even during its prime, attracting visitors from across the Mediterranean world who came to witness what was increasingly regarded as one of the supreme achievements of human civilization. Greek traders and diplomats, accustomed to the modest scale of their own temple architecture, found themselves overwhelmed by the Labyrinth's complexity and grandeur. Their accounts, carried back to Athens and other Greek cities, began to establish the reputation that would eventually draw Herodotus himself to investigate these extraordinary claims. When Herodotus finally stood in the Labyrinth's courts, sometime around 450 years before the Common Era, he was experiencing a structure that had already been ancient for over a millennium. The building he explored had weathered centuries of political upheaval, foreign invasion, and cultural change, yet it remained sufficiently intact to justify his famous declaration that it surpassed even the pyramids in wonder. His detailed description of 3,000 rooms arranged in 12 courts reflects not merely the Labyrinth's physical complexity, but also its profound impact on a sophisticated observer who had travelled extensively throughout the known world. The comparison to the pyramids that Herodotus drew was not casual hyperbole, but a carefully considered judgment that reveals much about how the ancients understood monumentality itself. The Great Pyramid of Giza was already regarded as the supreme example of architectural achievement, a structure so perfectly conceived and executed that it seemed to transcend human limitations. For Herodotus to claim that the Labyrinth surpassed this ultimate standard suggests that he recognized something fundamentally different about Amenemhat III's creation, something that went beyond mere size or technical precision. What distinguished the Labyrinth from the pyramids was not its mass but its complexity, not its height but its intricacy, not its permanence but its functionality. Where the pyramids represented the triumph of engineering over physical limitations, the Labyrinth embodied the triumph of human organization over conceptual challenges. It was a structure that successfully integrated multiple functions, multiple symbolic systems, and multiple scales of meaning within a single architectural framework. This was monumentality of a different order, one that spoke not only to human ambition, but to human ingenuity in its most sophisticated form. The Greek and Roman writers who followed Herodotus continued to grapple with the challenge of describing something that seemed to exceed the normal capacities of language. Strabo wrote of its bewildering passages and countless chambers, while Pliny the Elder struggled to convey the overwhelming impression created by its architectural complexity. Their accounts reveal a consistent theme. The Labyrinth's impact on visitors went beyond mere admiration to approach something like awe, a recognition that they were confronting human achievement at its absolute limits. Yet even as these ancient observers celebrated the Labyrinth's magnificence, they were documenting a structure already in decline. The Egypt that Herodotus visited was no longer the confident, hydraulically sophisticated civilization that had created the Labyrinth. The complex systems of canal management that had originally justified its construction were failing. The administrative apparatus that had once filled its chambers was diminished, and the religious certainties that had inspired its creation were giving way to foreign influences and internal doubts. The labyrinth that impressed the Greeks was already becoming a monument to a lost world rather than a functioning centre of a living civilization. In their attempts to capture the labyrinth's significance, these ancient writers were wrestling with fundamental questions about the nature of human achievement and the relationship between ambition and permanence. What does it mean to build something that claims to exceed all previous standards? How do we measure the success of monuments that outlast the civilizations that created them? The labyrinth, even in its declining years, forced these questions upon everyone who encountered it. The true genius of the labyrinth lay not in its size or even its complexity, but in the way its architectural design channeled the flow of power itself through carefully orchestrated patterns of movement and access. As you navigate the intricate passages that connect the complex's various functional areas, you begin to understand that every doorway, every corridor, every change in elevation has been calculated to reinforce the hierarchical relationships that govern Egyptian society. This is architecture as a form of social engineering, space organized to make abstract concepts of authority tangible and immediate through the physical experience of moving through the building. The 12 great courts that formed the labyrinth's primary organizational structure were arranged according to principles that reflected both practical necessity and symbolic meaning. The 6 northern courts, oriented toward the realm of the living, housed the administrative functions that kept the Fayum's hydraulic systems operational. Here, the spatial relationships were designed for efficiency, with connected chambers allowing documents and personnel to move smoothly between different aspects of water management, agricultural planning, and regional governance. Yet even in these practical spaces, the architecture subtly reinforced royal authority through the positioning of throne platforms, the placement of royal statues, and the careful regulation of sight lines that ensured the pharaoh's divine presence remained visible even when he was physically absent. The southern courts, dedicated to the mortuary functions that would ensure Amenemhat III's eternal well-being, operated according to different but equally sophisticated principles of spatial organization. Here, the movement of priests, offerings, and ritual objects followed pathways that had been carefully planned to support the complex ceremonies necessary for maintaining the royal K in the afterlife. You follow one of these processional routes, observing how the architecture gradually transforms the ordinary world of daily life into sacred space through subtle changes in lighting, acoustics, and decorative program. The control of access within the labyrinth reflected the broader structures of power that characterized Middle Kingdom Egypt. Not everyone who entered the complex was permitted to move freely through all of its spaces. Royal officials, temple priests, foreign diplomats, skilled craftsmen, and ordinary petitioners each followed different pathways that reflected their status and purpose. The architecture itself served as a form of social sorting, with doorways sized to accommodate different numbers of people, corridors designed to channel movement in particular directions, and chambers arranged in sequences that required progressively higher levels of authorization to access. The underground chambers, those 1,500 rooms that Herodotus described but was never permitted to enter, represented the ultimate expression of this principle of controlled access. Here, beneath the level of ordinary human activity, lay the most sacred and sensitive functions of the complex. The royal burial chamber occupied the center of this subterranean world, surrounded by concentric layers of storage rooms, preparation chambers, and ritual spaces that supported the eternal ceremonies necessary for the pharaoh's continued existence in the afterlife. The very difficulty of reaching these spaces reinforced their sacred character, while their concealment from casual observation protected the most precious secrets of royal ideology from foreign scrutiny. The economic systems that supported the labyrinth's operations were integrated into its architectural fabric in ways that made the flow of resources as carefully orchestrated as the movement of people. Storerooms positioned near the canal entrances facilitated the efficient unloading of tribute grain and trade goods, while workshops clustered around courtyards where raw materials could be processed under optimal conditions of light and ventilation. The placement of these functional spaces reflected a sophisticated understanding of logistics, with consideration given to the seasonal rhythms of agricultural production, the varying requirements of different crafts, and the need to maintain security for valuable materials. The ritual dimension of the labyrinth's daily operations required equally careful spatial planning. The morning ceremonies that symbolically awakened the divine presence within the complex began in the eastern chambers, where the rising sun provided natural illumination for the opening rituals. As the day progressed, ceremonial activities moved through the building in patterns that followed the sun's path across the sky, culminating in evening observances in the western chambers, where the setting sun symbolized the daily death and rebirth of the royal K. These ritual movements were supported by architectural features that enhanced their symbolic impact. Doorways aligned with celestial events, chambers designed with specific acoustic properties, and decorative programs that reinforced the theological concepts being enacted. The labyrinth's role in legitimating pharaonic authority extended beyond mere symbolism to encompass the practical demonstration of royal competence in managing complex systems. Foreign visitors who witnessed the smooth operation of the complex's administrative machinery would carry back reports of Egyptian organizational sophistication that enhanced the kingdom's diplomatic prestige. The very existence of such a structure proclaimed that the pharaoh possessed not only the resources to undertake monumental construction, but also the administrative expertise to make such complexity functional, rather than merely ornamental. In this way, the labyrinth served as both monument and advertisement, celebrating past achievements while simultaneously projecting power into future negotiations and relationships. Within the labyrinth's vast network of chambers and corridors, you encounter the human voices that give meaning to all this monumental architecture. The sound reaches you first as a gentle murmur, the accumulated conversations of dozens of people going about their daily work, their individual words blending into a soft acoustic backdrop that fills the great halls with the unmistakable presence of human community. As you move closer to the sources of these sounds, the individual elements begin to separate and clarify, revealing the rich complexity of lives being lived within these ancient walls. In a workshop near one of the northern courts, you discover a master stone carver instructing his apprentices in the precise techniques required to transform rough limestone into the intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions that cover so many of the labyrinth's surfaces. His voice carries the patient authority of someone who has spent decades perfecting his craft, explaining how each symbol must be carved to exactly the right depth to catch the light properly, how the spacing between characters affects both legibility and magical efficacy, and how the grain of the stone itself must be considered when planning the layout of longer inscriptions. The young men gathered around him listen with the intense concentration of students who understand that they are receiving knowledge that has been refined over centuries of practice. You move on through a corridor where the morning light streams through carefully positioned openings, illuminating the work of scribes who sit cross-legged on reed mats, their writing materials arranged with methodical precision on low wooden tables. These are the men responsible for maintaining the complex administrative records that keep the Fayum's hydraulic systems functioning, and their work requires not only technical skill, but also deep understanding of the engineering principles that govern water management in an irrigation-dependent civilization. One scribe carefully updates a map showing the current condition of canal banks throughout the region, while another calculates the optimal distribution of grain reserves to ensure adequate supplies during the lean months before the next harvest. The soft scraping of sandaled feet on stone floors announces the approach of a procession of temple priests making their way toward one of the southern courts, where the morning offering ceremonies will soon begin. They move with the measured pace that characterizes all ritual activity in the complex, their white linen garments rustling quietly as they walk, their arms laden with the flowers, incense and food offerings that will be presented to the divine presence within the royal mortuary shrine. The youngest priest carries a small bronze censer from which thin streams of fragrant smoke rise into the still air, creating patterns that seem to dance in the shafts of sunlight that slant through the high windows. The spatial experience of the labyrinth reveals itself differently to each person who moves through it, shaped by their purpose, their status, and their familiarity with its countless passages and chambers. As a visiting dignitary, you might be led through a carefully planned route that showcases the most impressive architectural features while maintaining appropriate protocols of access and security. You would pass through bright courtyards where the morning sun illuminates carved reliefs depicting the pharaoh's divine authority, then through progressively more intimate spaces where the play of light and shadow creates an atmosphere of increasing sanctity and mystery. The transition from the upper levels to the underground chambers represents perhaps the most dramatic spatial experience the labyrinth offers. You descend stone stairways that curve gently downward, the temperature cooling perceptibly as you move further from the sun-warmed surfaces above. The sound of your footsteps changes as well, acquiring a deeper resonance in the enclosed stone passages, while the air carries subtle hints of the cedar oil and natron used to preserve the precious documents and ritual objects stored in these sacred spaces. Oil lamps provide the only illumination here, their flickering flames creating pools of warm light that reveal chamber after chamber, extending into darkness beyond their reach. The labyrinth's reputation had begun to attract visitors from across the Mediterranean world even during its prime, drawing travellers who came specifically to witness what was increasingly regarded as one of the supreme achievements of human civilization. Greek merchants, accustomed to the more modest scale of their own architectural traditions, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of what they encountered here. Their guides, priests familiar with every passage and chamber, would lead them through carefully selected portions of the complex, explaining the purposes of different spaces while maintaining the mystery that surrounded the most sacred areas. The everyday logistics of maintaining such a vast complex required the coordinated efforts of dozens of specialized workers whose activities you can observe throughout the labyrinth's many functional areas. Water carriers move steadily between the wells and the various chambers where fresh water is needed for ritual purposes and daily cleaning. Servants responsible for maintaining the oil lamps that provide illumination in the underground areas make their rounds with practiced efficiency, trimming wicks and refilling reservoirs according to schedules that ensure no sacred space is ever left in darkness. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life in the Fayum create corresponding patterns of activity within the labyrinth, with periods of intense administrative work during planting and harvest times alternating with quieter seasons devoted to maintenance, planning, and the eternal ceremonies that sustain the royal K in its journey through the afterlife. The first signs of strain in the labyrinth's magnificent systems were subtle, manifesting not as dramatic failures, but as small inefficiencies that gradually accumulated over decades of operation. You might notice them during a quiet walk through the administrative quarters in the early hours before dawn, when the complex stood empty save for the night guards and the temple priests beginning their eternal round of ceremonies. A slight dampness in the air near certain underground chambers hinted at changes in the water table that would, over time, threaten the structural integrity of foundations designed for different conditions. The sound of water moving through the canal system carried new undertones, subtle alterations in flow patterns that suggested the gradual accumulation of silt in channels that had once run clear and swift. The Fayum's hydraulic infrastructure, for all its sophistication, remained vulnerable to the same environmental forces that had shaped the landscape long before human intervention. The annual flood that brought life to the region also carried enormous quantities of sediment from the Ethiopian highlands, and this material had to go somewhere. In the early decades after the labyrinth's construction, the system's engineers had successfully managed this challenge, regularly clearing channels and adjusting water levels to prevent the kind of build-up that could threaten the entire network. But such maintenance required constant attention, specialized knowledge, and significant resources, all of which became increasingly difficult to sustain as the political foundations of the Middle Kingdom began to weaken. The reign of Amenemhat III marked the high point of the 12th dynasty's power and prosperity, but even during his lifetime, subtle changes in Egypt's broader political landscape were beginning to create pressures that would eventually affect the labyrinth's operations. The centralized administrative system that had made the Fayum project possible depended on the royal government's ability to mobilize resources from across the kingdom, coordinating the activities of distant provinces and maintaining the complex relationships between regional governors, temple hierarchies, and the pharaonic bureaucracy. As succession disputes and economic pressures began to weaken these relationships, the flow of resources to peripheral projects like the labyrinth's maintenance became less reliable. You walk through chambers where the evidence of deferred maintenance is beginning to accumulate, though still subtle enough that casual visitors might not notice the changes. A doorway that once swung smoothly now requires additional effort to open, its bronze hinges beginning to corrode in the increasingly humid underground environment. Wall paintings that once gleamed with fresh pigments show the first signs of flaking where moisture has begun to penetrate the limestone substrate. The oil lamps that illuminate the sacred chambers burn less brightly now, their wicks trimmed less frequently, as the servants responsible for their maintenance are reassigned to more pressing duties elsewhere in the complex. The burden of sustaining such an ambitious architectural project extended far beyond simple structural maintenance. The labyrinth's 3,000 chambers required constant human attention to remain functional spaces rather than mere monuments. Scribes needed to be trained in the specialized skills required to maintain the hydraulic records. Priests had to be initiated into the complex rituals that sustained the royal mortuary cult. Craftsmen required ongoing instruction in the traditional techniques needed to repair and replace the countless decorative elements that gave the structure its symbolic power. All of this represented an enormous investment in human capital that could only be sustained as long as the broader civilization remained stable and prosperous. The changing political climate of the late Middle Kingdom created additional pressures that affected the labyrinth's operations in unexpected ways. Foreign visitors, once welcomed as evidence of Egypt's international prestige, began to be viewed with increasing suspicion as reports of political instability in neighbouring regions raised concerns about espionage and infiltration. The complex procedures that had once regulated access to different areas of the labyrinth became more restrictive, limiting the number of people who could observe its operations and gradually transforming what had been a showcase of Egyptian achievement into something more closely resembling a fortress. These developments inevitably affected how the labyrinth was perceived and described by the foreign observers, whose accounts would eventually reach Herodotus and other Greek writers. Where earlier visitors had been able to observe the complex's administrative functions firsthand, later travellers found themselves confined to carefully controlled tours that emphasized the monument's architectural grandeur while concealing the practical challenges that were beginning to threaten its long-term viability. The gap between the labyrinth's reputation and its reality was beginning to widen, creating space for the kind of mythologizing that would eventually transform a remarkable but human achievement into something approaching legend. The environmental challenges facing the Fayum region were compounded by broader climatic changes that affected the entire Nile Valley during the later centuries of the Middle Kingdom. Variations in the river's annual flood patterns, possibly related to changing weather conditions in the Ethiopian highlands, created new stresses for irrigation systems that had been designed to operate within narrower parameters. The labyrinth's engineers found themselves dealing with floods that were either too high or too low, requiring constant adjustments to canal systems and storage facilities that had once operated with predictable regularity. The transformation of the labyrinth from living monument to archaeological puzzle unfolds across centuries of gradual decline, deliberate destruction, and natural burial that have left modern scholars grappling with one of Egypt's most perplexing mysteries. When the first European archaeologists arrived at Hawara in the 19th century, armed with shovels and an insatiable curiosity about ancient Egypt, they found themselves confronting a landscape that seemed to mock the grandiose descriptions left by classical authors. Where Herodotus had written of 3,000 chambers arranged in 12 magnificent courts, they discovered scattered limestone blocks, fragments of granite columns, and the weathered stump of Amenemhat, the third's pyramid, rising from a field of rubble and sand. Flinders Petrie, whose methodical approach to excavation would revolutionize Egyptian archaeology, spent the winter of 1888 to 1889 systematically investigating the Hawara site. His detailed records reveal the methodical mind of a scholar determined to reconcile the gap between ancient testimony and present reality. He mapped the scattered foundations, measured the surviving architectural fragments, and carefully excavated the areas where the labyrinth superstructure had once stood. What he found was simultaneously disappointing and intriguing. Clear evidence that a substantial complex had indeed existed here, but nothing approaching the scale and complexity described by the classical sources. The mystery deepened when later archaeologists, including the German Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius, continued Petrie's work and reached similar conclusions. The physical remains simply did not support the ancient claims about the labyrinth's extraordinary dimensions, yet these scholars were too experienced to dismiss the classical sources entirely. They recognized that Herodotus, despite occasional exaggerations, was generally a reliable observer, and his account of the labyrinth contained too many specific details to be dismissed as pure fantasy. The puzzle, then, was not whether something remarkable had existed at Hawara, but rather how to explain the dramatic discrepancy between what the ancients described and what survived for modern investigation. The application of modern technology to the Hawara site has added new layers of complexity to this archaeological mystery. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2008 revealed large subsurface anomalies that suggest the presence of substantial structures buried beneath the accumulated sand and silt of millennia. These readings indicate geometric patterns extending over an area roughly 300 meters wide, consistent with the foundations of a complex building program. Yet the radar data also reveals the limitations of remote sensing technology when applied to heavily disturbed archaeological sites. The anomalies could represent the remains of the labyrinth as described by Herodotus, or they could indicate more modest structures that have been enlarged by subsequent construction, geological processes, or simply the accumulation of debris over time. The challenge of interpreting these conflicting forms of evidence has led scholars to develop more nuanced theories about what may have existed at Hawara and what happened to it over the intervening millennia. One possibility is that the labyrinth was indeed constructed on something approaching the scale described by classical authors, but that subsequent dismantling for building materials during the Roman and Islamic periods reduced it to the fragmentary remains that modern archaeologists have discovered. Ancient monuments were frequently quarried for stone when political conditions made new construction more practical than monumental maintenance, and the labyrinth's location in a relatively remote area would have made systematic dismantling both feasible and economically attractive. Another theory suggests that the classical descriptions, while based on genuine observation, were systematically exaggerated by the cultural expectations and linguistic conventions of Greek and Roman writers. The number 3000, used by Herodotus to describe the labyrinth's chambers, may have been intended as a symbolic expression of immensity rather than a literal count. Similarly, the complexity that so impressed ancient visitors may have seemed more extraordinary to observers accustomed to the simpler architectural traditions of the classical world than it would to modern archaeologists familiar with the sophistication of Egyptian temple complexes. The rising water table in the Fayum region represents another factor that has complicated both the labyrinth's preservation and its modern investigation. Changes in the Nile's behaviour, modifications to the regional canal system, and the construction of modern irrigation works have all contributed to creating conditions that are fundamentally different from those that existed when the labyrinth was built. Chambers that were once dry and accessible may now be permanently flooded, while foundations designed for specific soil conditions may have been undermined by changes in groundwater levels. The story of the labyrinth's disappearance also involves the more subtle process by which memory transforms into legend, and legend eventually diverges from historical reality. Each generation of storytellers, from the Greek travellers who first described the monument to the Arab historians who preserved its memory during the medieval period, inevitably filtered their accounts through their own cultural assumptions and narrative expectations. Details that seemed insignificant to one observer became central to another's account, while aspects of the original structure that failed to match contemporary ideas about what made architecture impressive were gradually forgotten or transformed. The labyrinth that exists in the historical record is thus as much a creation of literary imagination as architectural reality. This does not make it false, but it does make it complex in ways that purely archaeological evidence cannot fully address. The task facing modern scholars is not simply to determine what physical structure once stood at Hawara, but to understand how that structure was perceived, described, and remembered by the various communities that encountered it across more than 2 millennia of historical change. The centuries following the labyrinth's abandonment as an active administrative centre reveal the remarkably adaptive ways in which human communities respond to monumental ruins, transforming what was once a symbol of centralised power into something entirely different yet equally valuable to the people who inherited its stones. During the Roman occupation of Egypt, when the Fayum had become just another province in a far-flung empire, local communities began the patient process of salvaging useful materials from the labyrinth's deteriorating superstructure. You can imagine the practical conversations that preceded this work. Families and village councils weighing the effort required to transport massive limestone blocks against the value of having dressed stone for their own construction projects. The Roman engineers who surveyed the site during the early centuries of the Common Era approached the labyrinth's remains with the systematic efficiency that characterized their civilization's relationship with the monuments of conquered peoples. They recognized the quality of the stonework and the strategic value of the location, but they felt no particular obligation to preserve a structure that served neither their administrative needs nor their religious sensibilities. Granite columns that had once supported the roof of sacred chambers were repurposed as foundation elements for more modest buildings, while carved reliefs that had proclaimed the divine authority of long-dead pharaohs were turned face down and used as ordinary paving stones. Yet this process of adaptive reuse also ensured a form of survival for the labyrinth that pure preservation might not have achieved. The limestone blocks that were removed from the site were incorporated into houses, workshops, and public buildings throughout the region, carrying with them fragments of the original structure's craftsmanship and symbolic power. Hieroglyphic inscriptions that had once formed part of elaborate theological programs found themselves serving as lintels over doorways or as cornerstones in garden walls, their original meaning forgotten, but their presence still marking these humble structures as somehow special, somehow connected to a grander past. The rising water table that began to affect the Hawara site during the late Roman and early Islamic periods created an entirely different kind of transformation, one driven by natural rather than human forces. As the management of the Nile flood patterns changed under successive administrations, and as the ancient canal systems were abandoned or modified to serve different agricultural priorities, groundwater levels began to rise throughout the Fayum Depression. The underground chambers that had once been the labyrinth's most sacred spaces gradually filled with brackish water, creating conditions that would preserve some artifacts while destroying others, according to the unpredictable chemistry of partial submersion. You walk across the modern Hawara site during the cooler hours of early morning, when the accumulated heat of the desert day has dissipated, and the air carries hints of moisture from the distant canals. Beneath your feet, layers of wind-blown sand and silt have accumulated to depths of several meters, creating an artificial landscape that bears little resemblance to the carefully planned topography of the original complex. The subtle mounds and depressions that mark the location of buried foundations create patterns visible only to trained archaeological eyes, while modern irrigation ditches cut straight lines across what were once magnificent courtyards and sacred chambers. The survival of the labyrinth in literary memory represents perhaps its most successful adaptation to changing circumstances. The accounts preserved by Greek and Roman writers ensured that knowledge of the structure's existence would persist long after its physical remains had been scattered or buried, creating a form of immortality that transcended the limitations of stone and mortar. Medieval Arab historians, drawing on these classical sources, continued to include descriptions of the labyrinth in their geographical works, though by then it had become a purely literary phenomenon, known only through texts rather than direct observation. The transformation of the labyrinth from monument to memory also illustrates the complex relationship between historical accuracy and cultural meaning. Each generation of writers who described the structure inevitably filtered their accounts through contemporary assumptions about what made architecture impressive or significant. The 3,000 chambers that Herodotus had counted became, in later retellings, symbols of incomprehensible complexity rather than specific architectural features, while the labyrinth's integration of sacred and secular functions was gradually simplified into more familiar categories of temple or palace. The excavation challenges that face modern archaeologists at Hawara reflect both the site's complex history of reuse and burial and the broader difficulties of investigating monuments that were designed to integrate multiple functions within single architectural frameworks. Traditional excavation techniques, developed primarily for investigating tombs and temples, prove inadequate when applied to the remains of administrative complexes where the boundaries between different functional areas were deliberately blurred. The high water table that now characterizes the site makes systematic excavation of the underground chambers extremely difficult, while the scattered nature of the surviving surface remains requires archaeological approaches that can work effectively with fragmented and disturbed contexts. The modern quest to understand what remains of the labyrinth has brought 21st century technology to bear on one of archaeology's most persistent mysteries, revealing tantalizing glimpses of buried structures while simultaneously highlighting the limitations that govern all attempts to recover the deep past. In 2008, a team of Belgian and Egyptian researchers deployed ground-penetrating radar across the Hawara site, their equipment sending electromagnetic pulses deep into the accumulated layers of sand and silt that have transformed the ancient landscape beyond recognition. The data they collected painted a picture of geometric anomalies extending over an area roughly the size of 6 football fields, patterns too regular and extensive to represent natural geological formations. These radar signatures suggested the presence of substantial foundations buried at depths that conventional excavation would find difficult to reach. creating a form of archaeological evidence that is simultaneously compelling and frustrating. The technology can detect large-scale structural remains, but it cannot distinguish between the ruins of the labyrinth as described by Herodotus and more modest buildings that might have been constructed on the same site during later periods. The electromagnetic waves that penetrate the Earth return with information about density and composition, but they cannot reveal the artistic sophistication, the functional complexity, or the cultural significance of whatever lies beneath. The challenge of interpreting these remote sensing results reflects broader methodological questions that face modern archaeology when dealing with sites that have been continuously occupied, modified, and disturbed over millennia. The Hawara site contains not only the remains of Amenemhat III's original complex, but also the accumulated debris of Roman construction projects, Islamic period settlements, and countless smaller interventions by local communities seeking building materials or agricultural land. Distinguishing between these different phases of activity requires techniques that can work effectively with fragmentary and overlapping evidence. The rising water table that now characterizes the Fayum region presents perhaps the most significant obstacle to systematic investigation of the labyrinth's underground chambers. Modern drilling projects have confirmed that groundwater now stands at levels that would flood any attempt to excavate the 1,500 rooms that Herodotus claimed to exist beneath the surface complex. The same hydrological changes that helped preserve organic materials in some waterlogged contexts have also created conditions that make traditional archaeological methods nearly impossible to apply. These practical limitations have forced scholars to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how archaeological knowledge is produced and validated. The labyrinth represents a case study in the gap between textual evidence and material remains, challenging archaeologists to develop new approaches that can work effectively when physical excavation is impractical or impossible. The radar anomalies provide tantalizing hints about what might lie beneath the surface, but they cannot answer the deeper questions about how the labyrinth functioned, why it was built on such a scale, or what its existence reveals about the capabilities and ambitions of Middle Kingdom civilization. The broader implications of the labyrinth mystery extend far beyond the specific case of the Hawara site to touch on fundamental questions about how civilizations create, maintain, and lose monumental architecture. The structure that Herodotus described represented an extraordinary concentration of resources, knowledge, and organizational capacity, yet it has vanished so completely that modern scholars debate whether it ever existed as described. This pattern of monumental construction, followed by near-complete disappearance, is not unique to ancient Egypt, but the labyrinth represents perhaps the most dramatic example of how even the most ambitious human achievements can be reduced to scattered fragments and conflicting memories. The story of the labyrinth's investigation also illustrates the evolving relationship between archaeological science and popular imagination, in an age when technology promises to reveal secrets that have remained hidden for millennia. Media reports of the 2008 radar survey often described the findings as evidence of a lost labyrinth discovered beneath the Egyptian desert, creating expectations that the mystery had been definitively solved. The reality, as is so often the case in archaeological research, proved more complex and ambiguous. The radar data confirmed that something significant lies buried at Hawara, but it did not resolve the fundamental questions about what that something might be or how it relates to the classical descriptions. The labyrinth thus occupies a unique position in the landscape of archaeological investigation, representing both the promise and the limitations of modern technology when applied to ancient mysteries. It stands as a reminder that some forms of knowledge may be permanently lost, buried not only beneath accumulated sand and rising groundwater, but also beneath the accumulated weight of cultural change and memory transformation. Yet it also demonstrates the persistence of human curiosity and the willingness of each generation to bring its most sophisticated tools to bear on the puzzles left by previous civilizations. The questions that the labyrinth poses about the relationship between ambition and permanence remain as relevant today as they were when Herodotus first tried to capture its significance in words. How do we measure the success of monuments that outlast the civilizations that created them? What does it mean to build something that claims to surpass all previous achievements? The buried chambers of Hawara continue to hold their secrets, waiting beneath the desert floor like a vast question mark carved in stone. You find yourself standing once more at the edge of the Hawara site, as the evening light begins to soften the harsh contours of the desert landscape, the scattered stones and weathered foundations taking on the golden hue that transforms even ruins into something approaching beauty. The wind carries with it the accumulated silence of centuries, and in this quiet moment between day and night, you can feel the weight of all the stories that have brought you to this place. The labyrinth that once stood here, whether it contained 3,000 chambers or 300, whether it truly surpassed the pyramids or merely impressed foreign visitors with unfamiliar complexity, has become something larger than the sum of its architectural elements. The physical remnants that survive at Hawara represent only one thread in the labyrinth's continuing existence. The limestone blocks that were carried away to build houses and workshops in nearby villages, the granite columns that were repurposed as foundation stones for Roman buildings, the countless fragments that were ground down for lime or simply abandoned to the patient work of wind and weather, all remain part of the structure's legacy. The labyrinth did not simply disappear, it was transformed, dispersed, integrated into the living fabric of human community in ways that pure preservation could never have achieved. In this dispersal, there is perhaps a form of immortality more profound than any monument could provide. The Greek and Roman texts that preserved the labyrinth's memory through the long centuries of its physical decline offer a different kind of legacy, one that speaks to the human need to witness and record achievement, even when that achievement cannot be fully understood or replicated. Herodotus and his successors were doing more than simply documenting an impressive building. They were grappling with fundamental questions about the relationship between human ambition and the passage of time. Their accounts, filtered through cultural assumptions and linguistic limitations, created a literary monument that has proved more durable than the stone and mortar had attempted to describe. The gap between ancient testimony and archaeological evidence that has frustrated modern scholars also carries important lessons about the nature of knowledge itself. We live in an age that places enormous faith in technology's ability to recover lost information, yet the labyrinth reminds us that some forms of understanding may be permanently beyond our reach. The radar anomalies beneath the Hawara site will continue to tantalize archaeologists with their geometric precision, but they cannot restore the lived experience of moving through those chambers, cannot recover the conversations that once filled those halls, cannot resurrect the complex web of relationships between sacred and secular authority that gave the structure its meaning. This limitation is not a failure of modern investigation, but a reminder of the fundamental incompleteness that characterizes all human knowledge. The labyrinth existed not merely as an arrangement of stones, but as a social system, a set of relationships, a way of understanding the world that was inseparable from the civilization that created it. When that civilization transformed and eventually disappeared, much of what made the labyrinth significant was lost regardless of what happened to its physical remains. The building that impressed Herodotus was already an archaeological site rather than a living monument, its original purpose and meaning as remote from his experience as his account is from ours. Yet in this incompleteness there is also profound beauty and instruction. The labyrinth story offers a meditation on impermanence that speaks directly to our own age of monumental ambition and technological confidence. The civilization that built the Fayum's hydraulic systems and raised the labyrinth above the floodplain possessed sophisticated knowledge of engineering, administration, and architectural design. Their achievements in water management and agricultural development supported populations and created prosperity that lasted for centuries. Yet all of this was built on foundations that proved vulnerable to environmental change, political instability, and the simple passage of time. The cautionary wisdom embedded in the labyrinth's history extends beyond questions of architectural preservation to touch on the sustainability of all human systems that depend on intensive resource management and complex coordination. The Fayum project succeeded brilliantly for as long as the broader civilization possessed the knowledge, resources, and institutional stability necessary to maintain it. When those conditions changed, even the most impressive achievements proved fragile. This pattern repeats itself across human history, from the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia to the urban networks of classical antiquity, reminding us that sustainability requires not only initial success, but also adaptive capacity and long-term thinking. As full darkness settles over the site, and the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, you realize that your journey through the labyrinth's history has been as much about questions as answers. The 3,000 chambers that Herodotus described may never be definitively proven or disproven, but their possibility continues to inspire investigations that push the boundaries of archaeological methodology. The structure's significance lies not in resolving the mystery, but in the quality of curiosity it generates, the careful thinking it demands, and the broader questions it raises about human achievement and the passage of time. The wind whispers across the stones with the same voice that has shaped this landscape for millennia, and you understand that the labyrinth was never really about architecture at all. It was a mirror of human aspiration, resilience, and the eternal dialogue between ambition and humility that defines every civilization's relationship with time.